I forgot to warn my son the camera was running again. When I reviewed it fully, I froze. The morning I found out, the house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I was in the kitchen with my tea, listening to the refrigerator hum and the soft tick of the wall clock. For weeks, that sound had been my only steady companion. I used to tell myself the quiet meant peace. A woman my age deserved peace. But lately, the silence had felt different. Thicker, watchful, as if something in my own home was listening back. 3 days earlier, I had called a technician to repair the security system. The cameras had been down for so long that I'd started sleeping with the hallway light on like a child. I didn't like admitting that fear had crept into my bones, but it had. I was 68, and the truth was simple. When you live alone long enough, you learn how quickly safety can become a fragile habit. Except I wasn't really alone anymore. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. My son Marcus and his wife Angelica had moved in, insisting it was for my good. They said the neighborhood had changed, that I shouldn't be by myself, that I needed company and help. Marcus said it with the tender voice he used when he wanted something. Angelica said it with the brisk confidence of a person who had already decided. I agreed because refusing felt exhausting. I agreed because part of me still believed that a mother's home was a kind of sanctuary, something blood couldn't betray. And I forgot to tell them about the repair appointment. That slip, small, ordinary, almost ridiculous, would end up saving me. The technician came while Marcus and Angelica were out. He replaced a fried component, checked wiring, and installed a new phone app so I could view the feeds whenever I wanted. He showed me how to tap the icons, how to switch between rooms, and how to adjust the sound. His hands were steady, his voice calm, like someone repairing a toaster instead of restoring a woman's sense of security. When he left, I told myself I would test it later. But something tugged at me that morning, an unease I couldn't name. Maybe it was the way Angelica had been watching me lately, measuring my words. Maybe it was how Marcus had started answering questions I hadn't asked. Or maybe it was just the old instinct that had kept me upright through night shifts and heartbreak and the long years of being the only adult in the room. Marcus had said he was going to a job interview. Angelica had said she needed groceries. I watched them leave. I heard the front door shut. I waited for the sound of the car pulling away. Then I opened the app. The first camera that loaded was the living room. The image was clear enough to make me blink, like seeing my own face under harsh lighting. For a moment, I expected emptiness, sunlight on the curtains, the quiet couch, the little framed photo of Marcus at graduation. Instead, I saw movement. Marcus and Angelica were there. Not just there, settled, purposeful, as if they'd been waiting for the stage to be empty so they could begin. My coffee table was covered in papers. My papers. The neat stacks I kept inside my bedroom desk, the ones I always returned to their places like a ritual. Things I hadn't touched in months because the sight of them made me think about endings, wills, beneficiaries, plans for when the body finally insists on rest. My throat went dry. Marcus held my folder, the dark one with the clasp. The one that should have been locked away. Angelica stood near the window, lifting documents toward the light, her head tilted like she was inspecting jewelry. Their faces weren't guilty. They looked practiced. I switched to audio with trembling fingers, and the sound that came through the tiny speaker on my phone didn't feel real at first, like a television show playing in another room. Then I heard Angelica speak, crisp and cold. "Where's the original deed?" The question snapped something inside me, sharp as glass. Marcus answered with irritation, not confusion. "It has to be here. She keeps everything in order. Like, obsessively." I heard my own breath, loud in my ears. I pressed the phone closer, as if proximity could change what I was hearing. Angelica flipped another page. "Albert said it needs to be the original. Not copies, not photos. The original makes it clean." Albert. The name landed in my stomach like a stone. I had met Albert once, briefly. Marcus introduced him as a friend who knew law stuff. He had a smile that didn't reach his eyes and hands that moved too fast. I remembered thinking he looked like a man who could talk his way out of a locked room. Now his name was in my living room like an intruder. Marcus muttered, "She might have it in some kind of safe box." Safe box where? Angelica asked. There was no concern in her voice, only impatience, as if my caution was an inconvenience. Find it. He gave us until Friday. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. My knuckles went white. Angelica lifted a paper higher. Look at this appraisal. Over 500,000. Her voice softened the way it does when greed dresses itself as admiration. That house is worth everything. My house. The house I'd bought with 30 years of nursing paychecks and overtime. The house where I'd bathed Marcus in the kitchen sink when he was small because the bathroom was being remodeled and I couldn't afford to reschedule. The house where I'd sat up on the couch at 2 in the morning sewing his Halloween costume because he wanted to be an astronaut and the store-bought ones looked cheap and I couldn't stand the thought of him feeling less than the other kids. 500,000 meant nothing to me compared to what the walls had held. Show them. It meant a door out. Angelica's next words came without hesitation. Once it's transferred, we can sell it. Put her somewhere smaller. A 1-bedroom is enough. Her. She didn't say my name. She didn't say Mom. She said her like I was furniture. Marcus didn't protest. He just let out a sigh like the problem was logistics. She's stubborn. She'll want to read everything. Angelica gave a small laugh that made my skin crawl. She won't read it if we play it right. We tell her it's insurance. We tell her it's urgent. Marcus tapped the papers with his fingers. She's been more forgetful. Sometimes she mixes dates. We can use that. There it was, the shift that made my stomach lurch. They weren't just planning to steal paper. They were planning to steal my credibility. Angelica's voice grew almost cheerful. We frame it like we're helping. We act worried. We say we need legal authority in case her memory gets worse. Marcus hesitated then, and a tiny flicker of my old son showed in his face. He rubbed the back of his neck the way he used to when he felt ashamed. I hate this. My heart, foolish as it was, reached for that hesitation like it was a rope. Angelica stepped closer to him, her hand landing on his shoulder with practiced ownership. Don't start. Think about our future. Think about what we want. We can't stay stuck begging for allowance from an old woman forever. Allowance. The word was poison. I gave them $700 a month, not because I enjoyed it, but because every time I didn't, the house became a battlefield of sighs and slammed cupboards and quiet punishment. I watched Marcus' face change. He swallowed whatever tenderness was left and replaced it with resolve. You're right, he said, and the sound of it hollowed me out. It's time to think about us. They began stacking my papers back into piles, but not neatly. They didn't restore anything to its place. They moved like people who felt entitled to disorder. Marcus paused near the camera. For one terrifying second, he looked straight toward it, and my pulse stuttered. Then he turned away, as if the world was simple and he had nothing to fear. I sat down hard on a kitchen chair. My tea had gone cold, forgotten. My hands shook so much I nearly dropped the phone. I didn't cry. Not yet. Shock doesn't come with tears. It comes with numbness, with the strange sensation that you are watching someone else's life. A nurse learns how to function inside emergencies. You learn how to act while your insides panic. That training returned to me like an old muscle memory. I recorded the feed. I saved it. I replayed it to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. I hadn't. Over the next hours, I moved through the house like a ghost. When Marcus and Angelica finally left for real, I didn't confront them. I didn't scream. I didn't break down. I cleaned the kitchen. I wiped a counter that was already clean. I folded a towel just to do something with my hands. Then I went to my bedroom and checked my desk. The lock was scratched. A small, ugly mark that told me the truth had hands. That night at dinner, Marcus kissed my forehead the way he'd done since he was a teenager. Angelica asked if I needed anything from the store. Their voices were warm, normal, sweet enough to make a stranger think I was lucky. I smiled until my cheeks hurt. Inside, something had changed. Something fundamental. A door closed. I had evidence now, real evidence. Not feelings, not intuition. Their own words, their own plans, spoken casually in my living room. And I knew what they didn't. The cameras were no longer broken. The house had eyes again, and I controlled them. For 3 days, I lived in 2 versions of my life. In one version, I was the mother. The harmless older woman who cooked, who nodded, who listened, who asked polite questions. I made breakfast. I offered Marcus extra tea. I laughed at Angelica's thin jokes. I played the role they had written for me. In the other version, I watched. Every morning, while they thought I was reading in the sunroom or resting in my room, I checked the feeds. I listened. I collected. It didn't take long to realize that Tuesday hadn't been their first time. They moved through my things with the smoothness of repetition. They knew which drawers stuck. They knew how long it took me to shower. They weren't improvising. They were executing. On Wednesday, they tried a different approach. Breakfast. Marcus spoke with rehearsed seriousness. Mom, we need to talk. Angelica placed a folder on the table. Fresh papers, crisp edges, too official-looking. The kind of folder that exists to intimidate. We've been thinking about your future, Angelica said, voice syrupy. Your security. My security. The phrase sounded almost funny coming from her. Marcus reached across the table and took my hand like he was about to pray. We had some documents prepared. Just standard things, so we can help you if you ever need it. I let my eyes lower as if I was struggling to focus, as if reading made me tired. I flipped pages slowly, acting confused. And there it was in the fine print, language that handed them control. Authority. Permission. The ability to decide, to sell, to manage. Words like irrevocable, assignment, transfer. They had dressed a theft in legal clothing. I looked up, blinking like I didn't understand. Can you explain it? Angelica's smile twitched. It's boring legal stuff. Marcus tapped the lines marked with neat little X's. Just sign here, here, and here. I kept my voice soft. I want to read it. Angelica leaned forward. Marisol, it's long. You'll just confuse yourself. And it's urgent. Marcus added quickly. There are new rules coming next month. Taxes. It could hurt you if we don't update things now. A lie delivered like a kindness. I set the papers down. Let me think about it until tomorrow. The air changed. Their faces didn't harden, not fully, but the mask slipped enough for me to see what lived beneath it. Marcus' voice sharpened. We need it today. I tilted my head. Why today? Angelica's patience snapped like a thread. Because if you trust us, you'll sign. There it was again, the trap. If I didn't obey, I was ungrateful. If I questioned, I was unstable. If I resisted, I was the problem. I picked up the pen. I held it over the first signature line and paused, feeling their anticipation like heat. Then I set the pen down. I'm going to call my doctor first. Marcus exploded. Just sign the papers. The shout filled the room, loud and raw. It wasn't the voice of a worried son. It was the voice of a desperate man whose plan was slipping. Silence followed, thick and dangerous. Marcus tried to recover, dragging his face back into something softer. I'm sorry. I'm stressed. Angelica smoothed it over with false calm. We're all stressed. That's why we should finish this quickly. I stood, steadying myself with the back of the chair. I'm old, I said quietly, but I'm not stupid. Their eyes flickered, surprise, calculation, something close to anger. I took the folder and slid it into a kitchen drawer. Not because it was safe there, but because the act itself mattered. A small declaration. I still touched my own life. I still decided where my papers went. I went to my room and locked the door. On my phone, the camera showed them still at the table. Their voices dropped, but the audio caught enough. This isn't working, Angelica hissed. She was supposed to sign. She's getting suspicious, Marcus said. Angelica tapped her nails against the wood. Then we changed tactics. Her voice turned practical, as if discussing household chores. We cut things. Marcus frowned. What things? The extras, she said. The insurance. The rides. The grocery helps. Everything she depends on that her pension doesn't cover comfortably. Understanding spread across Marcus' face, and the worst part was watching him admire it. You mean, pressure her? Angelica's tone was almost pleasing. We make life harder until she gives in. She likes comfort. She likes routine. Take that away and she'll sign just to get stability back. Marcus exhaled, and then, like a man stepping fully into darkness, he said, 2 weeks. She won't last longer than 2 weeks. 2 weeks. The same timeline they had mentioned for the property transfer. The same ruthless schedule. I sat on my bed and stared at my phone screen until my eyes burned. That afternoon, Marcus made calls. I heard him telling someone that my supplemental insurance would be cancelled. I heard Angelica listing expenses like she was preparing a budget for war. And I realized something with cold clarity. They were not going to stop. Not because they were misunderstood. Not because they were stressed. Not because they needed help. They were going to stop only if something forced them. That night, I didn't sleep. I backed up the recordings in every way I could manage. I copied them to a small drive and hid it somewhere I knew Angelica would never look. I created a new email and sent the files to myself, naming them with plain, boring titles so they wouldn't draw attention. I moved carefully, quietly, as if my own house had become enemy territory. By Thursday morning, when they sat across from me with their practiced sympathy and began speaking about financial adjustments, I already knew exactly what they were doing. Marcus spoke with the gravity of a man acting in a play. We've had some setbacks. Angelica sighed dramatically. We may need to cut back. I held my coffee with steady hands, pretending to be calm. Cut back on what? Marcus hesitated, then said, your insurance. The car for appointments. Some of the extra things. Angelica's eyes stayed on my face, hunting for panic. I took a sip, slow, controlled. I see. Their confidence wavered. They had expected pleading. They had expected fear. They had expected me to crumble. Angelica leaned forward, voice smooth. But if we finalize those legal documents, it will give us the security to support you properly. I set my cup down. The porcelain clicked against the table like a gavel. So the papers weren't for my protection, I said quietly. They were leveraged. Marcus' jaw tightened. Mom, that's not. No, I interrupted. The word came out firmer than I expected. You want what's best for you. The silence that followed was absolute, as if even the house had stopped breathing. Angelica's smile appeared. Small, sharp. Be careful, Marisol. At your age, it's easy to misunderstand. There it was. The shift. The new direction of their attack. Not the deed. Not the documents. My mind, my credibility, my sanity. And as I watched them exchange that familiar glance, the one couples share when they're aligned in something secret, I understood with a chill that the next phase of this war would be darker than the first. Because stealing a house was one kind of betrayal. Stealing a person's reality was another. And they were about to try both. By the end of that week, the house no longer felt like my own. Not because the walls had changed or the furniture had moved, but because the air itself seemed altered, as if every room carried an unspoken accusation. Marcus and Angelica had perfected a new performance, one far more dangerous than the first. They no longer acted like conspirators hiding a crime. They acted like caretakers managing a problem to me. Every question they asked was wrapped in concern. Every look carried pity. Every gesture was gentle in a way that felt rehearsed, calculated, almost clinical. Did you sleep well, Mom? Marcus would ask, watching my face carefully, like he was taking notes. You look a little tired today, Angelica would add. Are you feeling confused at all? Confused. That word became their favorite weapon. If I said yes, it would prove their point. If I said no, they would exchange looks that said denial was part of the illness. They had turned the ground beneath me into something unstable, and I could feel how easily a misstep could swallow me whole. On Friday morning, I overheard Marcus on the phone. He wasn't whispering. He didn't need to. Dr. Rodriguez, this is Marcus Jones, he said, his voice heavy with worry. I'm really concerned about my mother. My stomach dropped. Dr. Rodriguez had been my physician for years. She had seen me through surgeries, grief, exhaustion, and recovery. She knew my habits, my health, my mind. If anyone's opinion mattered, it was hers. Yes, Marcus continued. Paranoia. Severe paranoia. She thinks we're trying to steal her house. I froze in the hallway, my hand gripping the doorframe. She installed cameras to spy on us, he said. She's been accusing us non-stop. It's getting worse. Each word felt like a nail driven carefully into a coffin I hadn't agreed to lie in. Angelica joined the conversation later, her voice soft and practiced. We're scared for her, doctor. And honestly, a little scared for ourselves. Scared. Of me. When the call ended, I retreated to my room and locked the door. My hands shook as I opened the camera app, desperate to record anything else that might save me. One of the cameras had no audio. That wasn't an accident. They had been careful. Smarter than I had given them credit for. They were removing my lifelines one by one while smiling at me over breakfast. That afternoon, their kindness intensified. Marcus asked if I had a headache. Angelica insisted on bringing me water. They spoke slowly, gently, as if I might break at any moment. It was terrifying. That night, I heard them planning. She can't refuse the appointment, Angelica said. We tell her it's routine. And if she doesn't go? Marcus asked. She won't have a choice. The words were calm. Matter of fact, I understood then what they were aiming for. Not persuasion, not pressure, but control. A medical label. A paper that would declare me incapable, unreliable, unfit to decide my own life. I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, thinking of all the patients I had seen over the years who lost their voices not because they were ill, but because someone else spoke louder. Friday morning came with forced smiles. I scheduled a doctor's appointment for you, Marcus announced casually, as if he were telling me the weather. I don't need one, I replied. That's what worries us, Angelica said. Gently. The trap closed tighter. I didn't argue. I nodded. I played along. Because panic would only serve them, and resistance without preparation would destroy me. But while they believed I was surrendering, I was planning. That afternoon, when they left the house, I called Dr. Rodriguez myself. Doctor, I said when she answered. I need to speak to you privately. There was a pause. Marisol, she said carefully, are you safe right now? The question told me everything. Marcus' narrative had already taken root. My son and his wife are trying to take my house through fraudulent documents, I said calmly. When I resisted, they decided to make me look mentally unstable. Another pause. Longer this time. These are serious accusations, she said. Do you have proof? Yes, I answered. And I can repeat their words exactly. I told her everything. The deed. The forged signatures. Albert. The money. The plan to institutionalize me. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. Marisol, you have no history of cognitive decline. None. Your last exams were flawless. So you believe me? I asked quietly. I believe we need to document the truth immediately, she replied. And protect you. That afternoon, in her office, she tested me thoroughly. Memory, logic, reasoning, orientation. I answered calmly, confidently, clearly. When she finished, she looked at me with something like admiration. You are mentally sharp, she said. Exceptionally so. The report she printed felt heavier than paper. It was armor. When I returned home, Marcus and Angelica watched me closely. What did the doctor say? Marcus asked. That I'm fine, I replied. Perfectly capable. Their relief was almost visible. Angelica smiled. That's wonderful. I told her I might review the documents again, I added casually. She said it was a good idea. Their eyes lit up. That night, while they slept, I made calls. TOA lawyer specializing in elder abuse, TOA private investigator. For morning, the plan was set. The investigator installed discreet microphones and cameras while Marcus and Angelica were still in bed, unaware that their final performance was about to be recorded in full. By afternoon, we sat together at the dining table again. The same papers. The same pen. This time, they were confident. They believed I was beaten. They were wronged, Marcus. Explained the documents. I asked questions. Innocent ones. Careful ones. And slowly, step by step, they confessed. The forgery. The fake certificates. The plan to sell my home. The intention to lock me away. They said it all. When I finally dropped the pen, the front door opened. The sound was final. Police. Lawyers. Truth. The handcuffs clicked shut around my son's wrists. I felt no triumph. Only clarity. Some betrayals are loud. Others smile at you across the breakfast table. And some lessons come far too late, but they still come. When the house fell silent again, it was no longer holding its breath. It was free. The silence after they were taken away felt unreal, like the pause after an explosion when the ears are still ringing but the danger has passed. The front door closed behind the officers, and the house settled into a stillness I hadn't felt in months. No forced concern. No measured footsteps behind me. No calculating eyes watching every movement. Just quiet. Clean. Empty quiet. I stood there for a long time, unsure what to do with my hands. The dining table was still cluttered with papers, pens, and lies. My chair was slightly pulled back, as if frozen in the moment I had risen. Everything looked ordinary, and yet nothing was. For the first time since Marcus and Angelica moved in, I was alone. That realization brought relief first, then grief, then something deeper and more complicated. It wasn't the grief of losing a son. It was the grief of realizing I had already lost him long ago, without noticing when or how it happened. I sat in my armchair, the one by the window, and stared out at the yard. The grass needed trimming. The rosebush near the fence had begun to droop. Ordinary problems. Honest problems. I welcomed them. Later that day, my lawyer returned to explain what would happen next. Charges would be filed. Evidence reviewed. Statements recorded. He spoke in calm, measured tones, as if this were any other case. But this wasn't any other case. This was my life laid bare in transcripts and recordings. This was my son's voice, stripped of excuses, preserved in cold clarity. That night, I slept for the first time in weeks without waking to check a door or listen for footsteps. My dreams were not peaceful, but they were mine. The days that followed were heavy with paperwork and quiet realizations. The house felt larger without them, echoing in places that had once been crowded with tension. I moved slowly, deliberately, reclaiming space room by room. Their bedroom was the hardest. I stood in the doorway, staring at the unmade bed, the cluttered dresser, the open suitcase they had never fully unpacked. For a moment, I wondered if I should cry. I didn't. I packed their things carefully. Not gently, but not cruelly either. I boxed their belongings and labeled everything clearly. Practicality has a way of anchoring the heart when emotions threaten to pull it apart. When I was done, I locked the door and returned the key to its hook. The room was no longer theirs. In the weeks that followed, the truth became public in the way truths always do. Slowly, painfully, and without mercy. Friends who had admired Marcus for taking care of his mother grew quiet when the charges were explained. Some avoided my eyes. Others apologized for not seeing it sooner. I learned something then. Betrayal thrives on appearances. Marcus called once from jail. Just once. His voice sounded smaller, thinner, stripped of its confidence. "Mom," he said. "Can we talk?" I closed my eyes before answering. "You're talking now." There was a pause. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." "That's the problem," I replied. "You never think that far." He began to cry, and for a moment, my heart betrayed me. 35 years of memories don't vanish just because truth arrives. "I'm your son," he said. "Don't you love me?" "I loved the son I thought you were," I answered softly. "I won't sacrifice myself for the man you chose to become." He didn't call again. Angelica never did. 3 months later, the deal was finalized. They relinquished all claims to my property, signed restraining agreements, and accepted prison sentences reduced by cooperation and mandatory rehabilitation programs. 18 months. Enough time, I hoped, to confront the damage they had done, not just to me, but to themselves. People asked me if I felt guilty. I told them the truth. Guilt is what you feel when you've done something wrong. I had done something necessary. Life settled into a new rhythm. Neighbors checked in. Old friends reappeared. I joined a small walking group in the mornings, discovered I liked gardening more than I remembered, and learned how quiet could feel safe again. The house became mine in a way it hadn't been in years, not because of ownership, but because of peace. Sometimes, late in the evening, I would sit by the window and think of the boy Marcus once was. The one who used to fall asleep on my shoulder. The one who called me from college just to hear my voice. I allowed myself to mourn him. But I did not regret choosing myself. Because love does not require self-destruction. Because motherhood does not mean surrender. Because dignity is not something you give away, it is something you defend. And in defending it, I finally learned the most important lesson of my life. Some doors close so that others, stronger, quieter, and more honest, can finally open. In the weeks after everything ended, time began to behave differently. It no longer rushed past me in anxious fragments, nor did it stretch endlessly with dread. It moved steadily, predictably, like a companion that had finally decided to walk beside me instead of chasing or abandoning me. Mornings became my favorite again. I woke early, not from fear, but from habit. Sunlight crept through the curtains and settled on the walls in soft patterns. I made my coffee slowly, enjoying the ritual instead of gulping it down with a knot in my stomach. 4 years, I had lived in survival mode without realizing it. Now, survival has given way to something gentler. Freedom. The legal process continued quietly in the background. My lawyer updated me when necessary, but there were no surprises anymore. The facts were solid. The evidence was undeniable. What once felt like an unbearable burden had turned into a closed chapter, sealed by truth and documentation. Still, emotional closure is never as neat as legal closure. There were moments, unexpected, intrusive moments, when memories would surface without warning. I would open a drawer and find one of Marcus's old school certificates I had forgotten to throw away. I would hear a laugh in a supermarket aisle that sounded too much like his. Each time, my chest tightened, not with regret, but with a dull ache for what could have been. I let those moments come and go. I didn't fight them. I had learned that resisting pain only gave it more power. One afternoon, a neighbor named Elena knocked on my door. She lived 2 houses down and had always waved politely but never lingered. That day, she brought homemade soup and an awkward smile. "I heard some things," she said gently. "I just wanted to check on you." We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where so much deceit had unfolded, and talked for hours. Not about the case, not about Marcus, but about life. About aging. About loneliness. About how easy it is for strong women to disappear behind expectations. That conversation changed something in me. I began reaching out more. Not because I was afraid of being alone, but because I finally understood that independence didn't mean isolation. Slowly, my world expanded beyond the walls of my house. I joined a local reading group. I started attending community events I had ignored for years. I reconnected with old colleagues who remembered me not as someone's mother, but as myself. For the first time in decades, my identity wasn't anchored to sacrifice. There were days when I questioned myself, usually late at night. Had I been too harsh? Had I failed as a mother? Those thoughts crept in quietly, disguised as responsibility. But each time they appeared, I reminded myself of the recordings. Of the words spoken without remorse. Of the calm cruelty in their plans. Love cannot exist where empathy is absent. Protecting myself had not been an act of vengeance. It had been an act of survival. One evening, months later, I received a letter from Marcus. Not a call, not a message through someone else, but a handwritten letter sent through his lawyer. I held it for a long time before opening it. The letter wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. It was a mixture of justification and wounded pride, of blame softened by selective regret. He spoke of hardship, of influence, of stress. He spoke of betrayal, but never acknowledged whose. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't respond. Some conversations do not deserve continuation. What surprised me most was not how much stronger I felt, but how much lighter. The fear that had once lived in my bones was gone. In its place was something steadier, a quiet confidence born not from youth or illusion, but from clarity. I installed new locks. I upgraded the security system again, this time openly. I reorganized my documents, not with anxiety, but with intention. Each act felt symbolic, like reclaiming territory that had been invaded not by strangers, but by misplaced trust. People often talk about forgiveness as if it is mandatory, as if withholding it is a failure of character. I learned that forgiveness is not a gift you owe anyone. It is a choice you make when and if it serves your peace. I chose peace. The seasons changed, so did I. I began planning small trips, nothing extravagant, just places I had always postponed visiting because someone else's needs came first. I took photographs. I laughed more easily. I slept deeply. One afternoon, while tending the garden, I realized I no longer felt afraid of growing old. Age had once felt like a weakness others could exploit. Now it felt like armor. 68 years had taught me things no one could take away. How to observe quietly, how to endure pressure, how to recognize manipulation, and most importantly, how to walk away from emotional blackmail without collapsing. The house stood strong, not because it was mine on paper, but because it was finally mine in spirit. Every room carried memories, but they no longer controlled me. I had learned that honoring the past does not require surrendering the present. Sometimes, late in the evening, I would sit with a book and pause mid-page, overwhelmed not by sadness, but by gratitude. Gratitude for instinct. Gratitude for technology. Gratitude for the quiet voice inside me that had whispered something was wrong long before I had proof. Most of all, gratitude for myself. Because when the moment came, when love was used as a weapon, when trust was turned into leverage, I chose to stand. Not as a victim. Not as a mother obligated to suffer. But as a woman who understood her worth. And that understanding, more than any house or document, was the true inheritance I gave myself. The months that followed unfolded slowly, like a body. Learning how to breathe again after being held underwater. At first, every day felt unfamiliar, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. There were no arguments waiting around corners, no footsteps behind me in the hallway, no carefully measured words meant to test my reactions. The absence of tension was so complete that it felt almost suspicious, as if calm itself was something I needed to learn how to trust. I woke early most mornings, not out of anxiety, but because my body had been trained for decades to rise before the world demanded it. I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, watching sunlight spill across the floor, and allow myself to exist without purpose for a few minutes. No caregiving. No anticipation. No vigilance. Just presence. It felt indulgent at first, even wrong, as though rest was something I had stolen rather than earned. The house slowly reclaimed its identity. I rearranged furniture not because it was necessary, but because it was mine to decide. I moved the dining table closer to the window, replaced old curtains, and donated things I had kept out of habit rather than need. Every small change felt like a declaration, quiet but firm, that this space belonged to me again, not to obligation or compromise. Some nights, memories arrived uninvited. They didn't announce themselves with drama. They came gently, wrapped in familiarity. The sound of the front door would remind me of Marcus coming home late from college during his first summer break, exhausted and hungry. The smell of laundry detergent would bring back years of washing uniforms, folding clothes, keeping life running smoothly behind the scenes. These memories did not accuse me. They simply existed, asking to be acknowledged. I learned to let them pass without judgment. Grief, I discovered, is not always loud. Sometimes it sits quietly beside you, patient, waiting until you stop pretending it isn't there. I didn't try to silence it. I let it speak when it needed to, And then I let it rest. Spring turned into summer. People began to treat me differently. Not with pity, but with something closer to respect. Word had spread, though softened and reshaped by distance and discomfort. Some avoided the subject entirely. Others asked careful questions. A few admitted in hushed voices that they had sensed something was wrong but hadn't known how to intervene. I didn't blame them. Silence is often the price people pay for not wanting to choose sides. What surprised me was how little I needed validation from anyone else. For years, I had measured myself through others' approval. As a good mother, a dependable woman, someone who endured quietly. Now, those measurements felt irrelevant. I had witnessed my own strength in a way no compliment could replicate. One afternoon, I found myself sorting through old paperwork when I came across a handwritten note Marcus had given me years ago. It was a simple thank you from his college days, scribbled quickly, words uneven but sincere. I held it for a long time. The handwriting belonged to someone I once knew intimately. The man who later tried to erase me had grown from that boy, but he was not the sum of him. I placed the note in a box and closed the lid gently. Not everything needs to be destroyed to be released. The garden flourished that year. I spent hours outside, kneeling in the dirt, letting my hands remember something older than betrayal. Growth. Seasons. Renewal without permission. Plants did not question whether they deserved sunlight. They reached for it instinctively. Watching them taught me more than any self-help book ever could. There were moments when loneliness tried to disguise itself as nostalgia. Late evenings were the most vulnerable. The house would be quiet, the television off, the world slowed to a whisper. In those moments, I reminded myself that solitude and abandonment are not the same thing. One is chosen. The other is imposed. I had chosen this life. Even if the choice came through pain, I filled the silence with things that belonged to me. Music I loved but had stopped playing because others found it irritating. Books I had postponed reading because someone else always needed something first. Small pleasures reclaimed from neglect. The support group became an unexpected anchor. Listening to others tell their stories, I recognized patterns I had once dismissed in my own life. Financial control disguised as care. Concern weaponized into authority. Love is presented as something conditional. I spoke only when necessary, but when I did, people listened. Not because I was louder, but because I was calm. Calm carries credibility. One woman thanked me after a meeting, tears in her eyes, saying she finally felt brave enough to question what had been happening in her own home. That moment alone justified everything I had endured. Strength multiplies when it is shared. As autumn approached, I took another trip, this time to visit a small town I had always admired but never prioritized. I walked unfamiliar streets without a schedule, sat in cafes without checking my phone, and allowed myself to be anonymous. No one knew my story there. No one needed to. I was simply a woman passing through, whole and unburdened. On my last evening, I watched the sunset from a quiet overlook and thought about the concept of inheritance. For years, I had believed my greatest legacy would be material. A house, savings, security. Now I understood that what truly mattered was an example. I had demonstrated that survival does not require submission, and that love does not excuse exploitation. When I returned home, I felt grounded rather than relieved. The house no longer represented something I had to defend. It represented continuity. A place where my life could unfold on my own terms. Another letter arrived from Marcus months later. This one was different. Shorter. Quieter. It acknowledged harm without explanation. It did not ask for forgiveness. It simply stated that he understood now that love without respect is not love at all. I read it once, folded it, and placed it beside the others. Some bridges are not rebuilt. They remain ruins, reminders of what once stood and what must never stand again. Winter returned, but it did not feel hostile. The cold stayed outside. Inside, I felt prepared. I decorated the house modestly, not out of tradition, but because beauty deserved space again. I invited neighbors over for dinner. We laughed, shared stories, and filled the rooms with warmth that did not demand anything in return. Late one night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and paused. The woman looking back at me carried lines earned through endurance, not regret. Her eyes were steady. Her posture relaxed. She was no longer bracing for impact. I realized then that the greatest change had not been external. The real transformation had occurred quietly, invisibly, in the place where fear once lived. I trusted myself again. My judgment. My instincts. My right to say no without apology. That trust was irreversible. The world did not suddenly become kinder. People did not magically behave better. But I was no longer available for manipulation disguised as affection. I no longer negotiated my dignity for peace. And in that certainty, I found something deeper than happiness. I found freedom, your right to be frustrated. And I'm going to explain clearly and honestly, without excuses, why this kept happening, and then fix it properly. The deeper winter settled in, the more I noticed how silence had changed its character. It was no longer sharp or accusatory. It no longer echoed with imagined footsteps or whispered intentions. It had softened, becoming something like a companion rather than a threat. I could sit for hours with a book untouched in my lap, simply listening to the house exist, and feel no urgency to fill the space with noise. I began to understand that safety is not the absence of danger, but the absence of fear. There were still moments when doubt tried to creep in, usually disguised as responsibility. Late at night, when the world narrowed to shadows and thoughts grew louder, I would ask myself whether things could have ended differently. Whether a different conversation, a firmer boundary earlier, or a softer tone might have changed the outcome. But those questions never stayed long. They dissolved under the weight of reality. The truth was simple and unyielding. No amount of patience could have corrected entitlement, and no sacrifice could have satisfied greed. Accepting that truth was not cruel. It was clarifying. I returned to routines that once brought me comfort but had been abandoned under constant tension. Baking bread on Sunday mornings. Writing letters by hand. Sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, watching shadows stretch across the yard. These were not acts of nostalgia. They were declarations of continuity. Life did not end because betrayal occurred. It adapted. The seasons passed with quiet consistency. Spring arrived again, tentative at first, then confident. I planted new flowers where old ones had withered. I chose bright colors deliberately, not because they erased memory, but because they announced their intention. I was not decorating a grave. I was cultivating a future. Occasionally, I would catch myself thinking of Marcus not with anger, but with distance. Like a story I once lived inside but no longer occupied. I wondered whether prison had stripped him of illusion or merely replaced one justification with another. I would never know. And more importantly, I no longer needed to. Freedom is not curiosity. Freedom is release. I attended a lecture one afternoon about elder autonomy and financial exploitation. The room was full, the audience quiet and attentive. As the speaker described patterns of abuse, I recognized every step, every tactic. The charm. The urgency. The manufactured concern. I felt no shock, only confirmation. When the discussion opened, I spoke calmly about the importance of trusting one's instincts, even when they contradict familiar faces. Afterward, several people approached me privately. They didn't ask questions. They thanked me. That was enough. My life continued not with dramatic reinvention, but with deliberate choice. I stopped apologizing for boundaries. I stopped explaining decisions that required no approval. I learned that politeness should never come at the expense of self-preservation. One evening, while old paperwork, I found the deed to my house. The original. Clean. Untouched. I held it briefly, then returned it to its place. It no longer felt like a symbol of vulnerability. It was simply a document, stripped of power because my sense of self was no longer attached to it. I understood then that what Marcus and Angelica had truly tried to steal was not my home, but my authority over my own life. And that authority had been restored not by police or lawyers alone, but by my refusal to surrender reality. As the year drew to a close, I sat by the window watching snow fall lightly across the yard. The world looked quiet, almost gentle. I felt steady, whole, no longer bracing for loss. Some lessons come wrapped in devastation. Others arrive quietly, long after the damage is done. The lesson I carried forward was simple. Love must never require blindness, and family must never demand silence. I turned off the light, climbed into bed, and rested without fear. The house stood firm around me, so did I.